A single blast in the Arabian Gulf may have just opened a dangerous new chapter in the struggle for control over the world's energy lifeline. What looked like one tanker on fire could become the spark that pushes oil markets, military forces, and global powers into a far more volatile confrontation. What just happened? A sudden explosion tore through the calm waters of the northern Persian Gulf, igniting a massive oil tanker and sending flames high above the deck. Sailors on nearby vessels reported seeing a fireball rise into the sky as emergency alarms flooded maritime radio channels. Within minutes, distress calls were spreading across one of the most sensitive shipping zones on the planet. According to Iranian media reports, naval forces linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed responsibility for striking a U.S.-linked oil tanker moving through the Gulf. Iranian officials said the vessel was successfully hit and left burning in the water as part of what they described as retaliation in the region's widening confrontation. That claim immediately sent shockwaves through global markets and military command centers. Because an attack on an oil tanker in the Gulf is not just a battlefield incident, it is a direct strike against the arteries of the global economy. The waters of the Arabian Gulf are not just strategically important, they are essential. Every day, giant tankers loaded with crude oil move through these routes carrying energy from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates toward major markets across Asia, Europe, and beyond. To reach the open ocean, those ships must pass through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow corridor that remains one of the most critical choke points in global trade. Nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through this region. That means when violence erupts here, the consequences do not stay here. A military clash in the Gulf can send prices surging in New York, trigger security alerts in London, rattle refineries in Asia, and force governments around the world to reassess their economic risk overnight. That is why this reported strike matters so much. It happened in a place where geography alone gives every incident global consequences. Iranian officials framed the attack as a deliberate message. State media suggested the tanker was targeted to demonstrate that hostile ships would no longer move freely through Gulf waters if the confrontation continues. In other words, Iran was not only claiming an attack, it was signaling a doctrine. The message was unmistakable. The Gulf itself is now part of the battlefield. Shortly after the explosion, the tanker reportedly began transmitting emergency signals. Flames spread across parts of the ship as the crew tried to contain the fire and stabilize the vessel. Nearby ships monitored the crisis. Maritime authorities moved to coordinate emergency response. But beyond the immediate danger to one vessel, analysts were already confronting the larger question. What happens when commercial shipping is no longer safe in one of the world's most important energy corridors? The answer is uncertainty, and markets hate uncertainty. The moment traders believe more attacks could follow, they begin pricing in disruption. If more tankers are hit, if routes are delayed, or if shipping companies decide the risk is too high, the flow of oil tightens. And when oil movement slows, prices do not wait, they jump. That is exactly what began to happen as reports emerged. Oil futures climbed as fears spread that the conflict could begin interfering with global supply chains. Shipping firms started reviewing routes. Some vessels slowed operations while awaiting updated security guidance. Maritime organizations warned ships in the area to exercise extreme caution. Insurance companies also began reassessing war risk coverage for tankers operating in the region. And that matters more than it sounds. When insurance premiums surge, the cost of shipping oil rises sharply. Those costs do not disappear. They move through the supply chain, from tankers to refineries to trucking networks to consumers. This is how one explosion at sea can start showing up in household budgets thousands of miles away. The United States began feeling the pressure almost immediately. As traders anticipated possible disruptions in global supply, diesel prices surged past $4 per gallon for the first time in nearly 2 years. That is not just a fuel story, it is an economic warning sign. Diesel powers the backbone of the American economy. Trucks delivering food rely on it, freight rail depends on it, farms use it to plant and harvest, heavy industry uses it to move raw materials and finished goods. So when diesel spikes, the effects multiply. Transport becomes more expensive, food distribution costs rise, manufacturing gets squeezed, inflationary pressure builds. In other words, a tanker strike in the Gulf can quickly become a cost of living issue in the United States. And the danger may not stop there. Analysts have warned that if attacks on tankers continue, the Strait of Hormuz could become increasingly hazardous for commercial traffic. Some recent shipping data already points to vessels avoiding parts of the Gulf because of escalating regional instability. If that trend grows, supply could tighten dramatically. Some forecasts suggest crude could approach the $100 per barrel level if disruptions persist. If that happens, gasoline prices would climb, diesel would rise further, airlines would absorb higher fuel costs, and global shipping expenses would surge. The ripple effects would reach almost every major economy. Asia and Europe would be especially exposed. Many energy-importing nations depend heavily on shipments passing through these waters. Strategic petroleum reserves can soften the shock for a time, but they are not a permanent shield. If the conflict stretches on, even major reserves may not be enough to fully stabilize the market. The military dimension is now just as serious as the economic one. The United States Navy maintains a strong presence in the Gulf for exactly this reason, to protect shipping lanes and preserve the free flow of energy through the Strait of Hormuz. Following reports of the strike, naval patrols intensified. Warships increased monitoring of commercial routes, while surveillance aircraft scanned the area for additional threats. But the operational challenge is enormous. The Gulf is crowded, narrow, and constantly moving. Oil tankers, cargo ships, fishing vessels, patrol boats, and military assets all share the same constrained waterways. Protecting every ship at every moment is nearly impossible. That is why tanker attacks are so destabilizing. They do not need to sink a fleet to disrupt global commerce. They only need to make shipping dangerous enough that fear does the rest. Strategically, this strike also reveals something deeper. The conflict is no longer confined to military bases or fixed land targets. Energy infrastructure and maritime trade routes are now directly in the crosshairs. For Iran, threatening oil shipments can serve as a powerful lever. It creates pressure not just on adversary militaries, but on global markets, political leaders, and economies dependent on stable energy flows. For the United States and its allies, that makes tanker attacks far more than isolated incidents. It makes them direct threats to the international commercial system. And once that system is under threat, the risk of escalation rises fast. For now, the situation remains fluid. Investigators are still assessing the damage, maritime authorities are warning ships to stay on alert, insurers are recalculating risk, traders are watching every headline, and military forces remain in a heightened state of readiness. But one reality is already clear. This was not just an explosion at sea. It was a warning shot across the world's energy map. And the question now is whether this burning tanker was a single incident or the opening move in a wider campaign against the global oil supply.